Thanks for tuning in to our talk about open source MDM in a sandbox. This is a talk about an open source project Ryan and I have put together that makes it easy to spin up and experiment with Nano MDM, a relatively new open source MDM server. Our talk and project was inspired by previous efforts like Tom Bridges' Monkey in a Box, which made it easy for Mac admins to spin up a server for Monkey, as well as my own previous project, MDM Sandbox, which automated the setup for a development micro MDM server. Before we get started, a quick disclaimer. Any reference to other companies or their products are meant for providing context to our talk only. These references do not imply endorsement by Airbnb. Now that the disclaimer is out of the way, I'm going to introduce myself in case you don't know me. I work on the client engineering team at Airbnb. Our team manages macOS, Chrome OS, and Windows. We also manage iOS and Android devices. I personally love writing tools in Golang, and nowadays our team generally prefers to write new tools in Go for both like on Mac CLI tools and backends. This is quite helpful when it comes to experimenting with open source MDM tooling because it just so happens that much of the open source MDM tooling is written in Go. I also personally love config management and open source client engineering tools. This might be obvious given that I'm currently giving you a presentation on open source MDM. Now I'm going to pass it over to Ryan so he can introduce himself.
Cool. Thank you. Sorry about that. My name is Ryan Deers. I work on the security engineering team here at Airbnb. I work a lot with Brandon's team on the client engineering side with the endpoint security. So that's like my first hat is endpoint security protection. And then my second hat is like infrastructure security. So working a lot with Terraforms. Some of my primary passions include working a lot with Golang and Python. As evident by just working in security, a lot of tooling's written in Python. And a lot of the tools that client eng writes is in Go. So I kind of love writing in Go over there. And obviously having a role with infrastructure security means I have to love using Terraform a bunch. So I do have a great passion for that. As with any infrastructure, it really helps to know a good few CM tools up your sleeve. So I typically work with Puppet and Chef. Cool. Now I'm going to discuss how we got started within the open source MDM community. So kind of in late 2020, when I first joined Airbnb, I focused a lot on endpoint security and kind of went through this career transition working with a lot of Windows fleets to the macOS system fleets. This required a large shift in how I had to manage systems at scale using this new thing called MDM, which I really thought was just for mobile phones. But in the Apple ecosystem, this is used for everything. So some of this work included when I got started was working a lot with Brandon's team on a product that they run called MDM Director. And I kind of worked on some projects to help create some MDM profiles to help deploy enterprise security or endpoint security and full disk access profiles for our tooling like OS Query, our EDR tools, and Santa. During this phase, we learned a lot of problems identified with the new endpoint security framework coming out, which is like the order of installation matters. So this leads me to early 2021, where we were working on deploying Santa, and the usage of endpoint security frameworks is that the order matters. So you have to have a profile before you have the agent installed or the agent breaks. So this is something where if you're running your own MDM stack, you can customize the workflow of how all this works from end to end. So you can make it work with Puppet and MDM Director all at the same time. Do note that several MDM commercial products make this very difficult to change and do like ordering of things. So this is one of the great reasons that like we like using open source MDM is it gives us a lot of flexibility that commercial products might not give us. And then up until today, within a few months ago, Brandon reached out to me on a project that he worked on called the MDM Sandbox and was like, hey, what if we took Nano MDM and put it in like this box form, like with the Terraform infrastructure and just make it easy to stand up. For me, it was a great learning opportunity because I like learning all the components and all these things of how they work. So I was like, cool, I get to really learn how MDM works at a fundamental layer because of all these components that have to be wired together. So I'm going to hand this over to Brandon to talk about his open source MDM journey.
Yeah, so around August 2020, before I worked at Airbnb, when there was a possibility that I was going to join client engineering, I really wanted to learn about open source MDM products that the Airbnb team was using. And so to get started with that, I decided to use Terraform to set up a repeatable and automated way to bootstrap micro MDM. And that taught me a bunch of things like how to use Terraform, how to deploy stuff to cloud, and also how micro MDM worked and what the dependencies were. And also a benefit that was that I could share this project with others, and it is posted to GitHub. Later in 2020, after I joined Airbnb, my manager pinged me and asked if I could cover on-call. This was pretty early in my career at Airbnb to be asked to do on-call, but a teammate was out of office and we needed coverage. It was a bit scary, but there's nothing better than suddenly being responsible for a tool to light a fire under your butt, to learn that tool deeply. And so I was suddenly responsible for the tool. And like I dug in and read about the tool and looked at our code and documentation to get ready to be on call for it. And then in March 2021, our team ran into some bugs with MDM Director and micro MDM. And to investigate what was going on here, I wrote some Golang tools to analyze the database to see what was happening behind the scenes. As this screenshot shows, it turns out that we were sending an excessive number of install profile commands. We were sending something like 270,000 per day, and this caused the micro MDM database to stall. So this was another way that I got deeper involved in MDM. I wrote some code to inspect VaultDB and like learned more about what was happening under the hood with micro MDM. So next, I'm going to talk about why we decided to do this project with Nano MDM by comparing Nano and micro. It might not be obvious why we chose Nano because, like, as I just discussed, my team has a lot of experience with micro MDM. And before I discuss the trade-offs, I just want to be clear that like this is a discussion about technical trade-offs, and it's not like meant to be a dunk on the authors for features or decisions they made. I really can't thank Garub and Jesse enough for building micro MDM and Nano MDM. This adventure and project and largely in my career at Airbnb wouldn't have been possible without these tools. But these are some of the reasons why you might choose Nano MDM over micro MDM. Nano MDM is easier to scale. With micro MDM, you can't easily horizontally scale because micro expects VaultDB to be available on the local file system. With Nano MDM, we can spin up multiple containers and horizontally scale, and all the containers will happily write to the same database. Nano MDM also makes state inspection easier. If you recall earlier, I discussed my adventures in inspecting VaultDB. I had to write like a specific tool to do that. There were no off-the-shelf tools, but inspecting state in MDM is a lot easier because it's just a database. You can pull open a MySQL client and just write some SQL queries. This is more similar to the experience of commercial MDM products, where you can often open a web interface to see at a glance what profiles and packages are being deployed to specific devices. And the last thing is that micro MDM is easier to stand up. So this is a downside of running Nano MDM. In micro, I found it a lot easier to get started. I didn't have to generate an enrollment profile by myself. I didn't have to stand up a production database, and I didn't really have to understand how SCEP certificates work. But this can also be seen as an upside for Nano MDM because I've learned the components of how the MDM protocol works on a deeper level, given that I had to stand up a lot more endpoints myself. So now I'm going to pass it back to Ryan to talk about the architecture that we came up with for Nano MDM in the sandbox.
Awesome. Thank you, Brandon. So here's kind of a high-level diagram of the Terraform infrastructure that we'll deploy to you if you clone our repo. One of the big things I call out, it's a very opinionated stance infrastructure, as in we want to assume that you might not have a thorough kind of built out Kubernetes environment or a place to run containers, or even just an account in general. So this thing can get you pretty much everything that you're looking at. So the VPCs to Route 53, all of this set up for you from ground zero. So that's kind of one of the call outs. We have a very opinionated stance on how we built this. To keep with this and to keep with ease of horizontal scaling, we decided to pick ECS and Fargate, one to be very easy to deploy all the containers that you can see on the right side, And as Brandon called out, there were some containers in here that, like, if you use micro MDM, you don't have to worry about. But because we're using nano MDM, we have to build some of the containers out. So some of these include like the SCEP server, an enroll HTTP handler. So this is something we had to build from the ground up. So that way you can just download the MDM enrollment profiles on the fly. Other containers in this include MDM director and translation layers between micro and nano. While we have an MDM director container in there, there are still a few bugs that exist. So we happily open PRs to try to help get this going for you. But we do include all the infrastructure set up there for you. In essence of keeping very low operation, like I said, we pick Fargate. We also use RDS Aurora serverless databases from Postgres to MySQL. And we openly offer you, if you want to take even pieces of this, like I said, it's a Terraform module, so you don't have to ship all of this or use some of it. Cool. So we have all this infrastructure built from the ground up, and just wanted to kind of highlight how you can get started with it pretty quickly. All of this is documented in our README document, so you can pick and choose what you want. Again, opinionated infrastructure. If you don't have anything going, we give you this one step from our makefile, this TF remote state. So it helps you set up an S3 bucket and get you going, so that way you can share this with others to kind of deploy on. Step 2 is our TF first run. And this kind of solves like a chicken and the egg problem. If you want to use ECR, we will have to put containers inside before we can use ECS. So this task kind of like builds all of our containers, puts it in ECR, sets up some necessary Route 53 records, so that way like the load balancers can work right away. And then the last step is our TF deploy. And this pretty much deploys everything that you saw on the last slide pretty quickly. Now I'm going to transition this over to Brandon to talk about one important necessary external dependency called Apple MDM push certificates. And he'll go over on how to procure one and kind of the route we took to get an MDM push certificate.
So first I'm going to talk about the proper way to do this, and then I'll talk about why me and Ryan went a different route. But the correct way to get yourself a MDM push certificate is to sign up for the Apple Developer Enterprise Program. So if you go and apply for this and ask for the MDM vendor certificate capability, that will enable you to either deploy an in-house MDM server for your own clients, or potentially enable you to provide MDM services for people you have a business relationship with, business customers. Unfortunately, the process here is like somewhat undocumented and opaque, but there's a number of people on MacAdmin Slack who've been through the process in recent months, and they've discussed their experience in the micro MDM channel. So I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to you about like what happened there and what the requirements were. So next I'm going to talk about how we like avoided doing this, because me and Ryan are not like a company who are running an MDM server like for a big enterprise. We just need this for development purposes. And so we used this service called MDM cert.download. It's a good option if you're doing development and experimentation. You can check out the website for what the requirements are, but I want to make sure to give a disclaimer on this. You should not use this for production purposes. We highly recommend for development and testing purposes only. You should apply directly to receive an APNS certificate and an MDM vendor certificate if you intend to do a production deployment. So next, I'm going to talk about a demo that we're going to show you of the infrastructure that we were talking about a few minutes ago. So the things that we're going to go through with the demo, first, we're going to show you an MDM read-only command. What I mean by read-only is that the command we send won't change the state of the enrolled device. It will just call something like profile list or certificate list to tell us information about the device, but change nothing. Then we'll show you how to install a profile. And in our example, we're going to install a custom wallpaper. As many of us know, forcing a wallpaper with the MDM protocol is a bad user experience because the user can't change it afterwards. So for that reason, we're going to show you how to do a remove profile command as well. So I'm going to pass it over to Ryan to show us the demo.
Cool. So I'm going to hop over to another computer right next to me. There's a bunch of things here, but anyways, one of the quick things that Brandon talked about was a read-only command. So we're going to use a tool under the Nano MDM tools repo, which is called CMDR, or I think I call it Commander. But anyways, this could do like certificate lists, profile lists, or any sort of like list command. So we're going to send the command off, and it looks like we sent off certificate list. Just so that way, you know, this is actually a live demo. We're going to go ahead and open up the CloudWatch and pull up the log on this. And I'm only going to do this for the first one just to make sure you can see. But really, we're looking for the NQ kind of knowledge here. So we can actually see that the command was queued up right here. And then we can see the acknowledge that goes with it. So this is a great place to kind of help debug logs and see what's going on. And this is all included in the AWS infrastructure that we deploy for you. So the next thing I have is the profiles window up, and we can see we have the Big Sur background up here behind us. So we're going to actually send a profile that will install this custom desktop background. Do note this is a little buggy as you're going to see the desktop flash. This is kind of the whole very, you know, in your face sort of thing. So as you can tell, we set it to our wonderful pink background. And now we're just going to demonstrate that we can go ahead and unset it. And you'll notice in the right that the profile goes away and we got our background that we set earlier. Cool. This concludes our live part of the demo. So I'm going to put it back on the slides and hand it over to Brandon to, well, that's if the demo worked or didn't work, but it did. The demo gods were in our favor today, so we can skip over this. And I'll give it to Brandon to talk about some final thoughts.
Yeah, so first thing I want to talk about is that there's a famous disclaimer in the micro MDM docs that micro MDM is not a product. What this means is that if you decide to run open source MDM like yourself in production, the buck stops with you. And also the open source MDM product might not ship with features that you expect. It's not built by like a huge company of software engineers. And so you might have to be prepared to build some features yourself. And this definitely applies to Nano MDM as well. Second, open source MDM is definitely a long journey. Me and Ryan have spent many hours putting together this Terraform infrastructure and done tons of troubleshooting, much of which isn't really related to Mac administration at all. We were troubleshooting AWS logs and trying to figure out why we couldn't SSH to boxes that we were setting up, figuring out why our containers were crash looping when the health checks failed. So like, it's definitely a complicated journey, but I personally find it really rewarding because it's given me the opportunity to wear a bunch of different hats. Like I started doing things that software engineers might do or SREs might do, and solution engineer as well, because we like design the architecture ourselves. Another thing I want to note is like me and Ryan are not MDM experts. We aren't principal or solution engineers at a commercial MDM company. We're just some engineers who came along and wanted to make it easier to stand up Nano MDM. We might have made some weird or potentially incorrect decisions with the way that we set up our infrastructure, but we'd like love for people to look at it and give us advice about how to make it better. Also, as Ryan mentioned earlier, our infrastructure is very opinionated. We assume, because me and Ryan did not have anything set up in our AWS account, we assume that you don't either. So it will deploy a VPC for you and it will use ECS and it will just assume that nothing is in your AWS account. If you have a mature AWS account or VPC that you want to deploy our code to, or a production container system, you probably can still get a lot of value out of some of the code that we publish, but you might have to change the way that the Terraform modules are engaged to plug it into your own system. So that might just take some changes with Terraform. And lastly, please audit the code before choosing to use it in production. Nano MDM Sandbox was written explicitly for this talk and is not used in production at Airbnb today. But I hope that maybe one day we will run something like it, but it will require some modifications to run in our company's production container system. You can grab the code at this URL. It's available on GitHub right now.